Thank you very much. Well, here it is. We're almost at the end of a journey of this day of the 22 Annual Symposium of the Yale Initiative on Sustainable Finance. And for this closing plenary, we have a very, very exciting fireside chat and lineup. And it is my honor to introduce you to both our keynote speakers, Allison Herren Lee, of course, who was commissioner at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the acting chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the securities regulator in the United States, and I like to say the architect of the SEC's ESG efforts, from climate disclosure rule to ESG funds. Allison is a securities law expert practitioner for many, many years, before times in government, for decades. Before her time in government, she was a partner at Sherman & Howard. She has a BA in business from the University of Colorado and a JD from the University of Denver, and she currently serves as adjunct professor and senior research fellow at New York University School of Law. And to moderate this great fireside chat is John Morley, a professor of law here at Yale Law School, a leading expert on the regulation and structure of investment funds. Perfect person to moderate this panel, who also is an expert on the law of trusts and a reporter for the Uniform Directed Trust Act. Prior to joining Yale Law School, John was member of faculty member at the University of Virginia Law School. He was, prior to that, the executive director of a Center for Study of Corporate Law here at Yale Law School, and he has a BA in political science and economics from the University of Utah and JD from Yale Law School. And it's my pleasure to have this two wonderful persons, experts in the field, talk to us about the regulation of ESG today in America. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to all of you for being here, and also Allison for joining us. It's a special pleasure to have you here, given your important role in designing the SEC's new climate disclosure proposal. So let's just start by getting us all on the same page here. There's a high degree of familiarity with people in this room with the climate disclosure proposal, but if you could it would be helpful if you could just describe for us briefly what the proposal is.
Sure, and I mean, it's only 500 pages long, so how much time do we have? It's interesting. I've done this a lot of times because I had to do this when we first put it together. I think of it in 5 parts. That's the first 3 come from the TCFD protocol, and it's risk, governance, strategy. Then the 4th piece, of course, is greenhouse gas emissions, and then the 5th piece is the disaggregation of climate impacts and consequences from line items in the financial statements. That's the abbreviated version. There's a lot packed into that, especially in the greenhouse gas emissions piece, and so I could go a little deeper on that if you'd like, or maybe you want to just...
I think we will in just a moment, but that's an impressively succinct summary. Let's actually start by talking about the motivations for the proposal. You were instrumental early on in inviting comment during your time as the acting chair, so it feels like you'd have some special perspective on this. What do you think, what was motivating you to push this project forward?
Sure, and that is all I can really speak to is my own, but you know, we had a team. It was a massive team effort. And honestly, it's pretty straightforward. It was investor demand. In my view, unprecedented investor demand. We had not seen, an entire kind of voluntary regime had built up based on this investor demand in a way that I think is unprecedented at some level in the history of the SEC. So that was the central piece of it. And but coupled with that is, because of this investor demand, as I said, this regime had built up. as you all know, a voluntary regime where thousands of companies are reporting some type of sustainability data, usually climate-related and potentially some others. And it's a real patchwork quilt. So I think it was really in danger of creating some misleading impressions because it lacked consistency, it lacked verifiability. There really was very little in terms of assurance around some of the data that was being put out, and it lacked standardization. So in my view, it was like there was an existing system that was broken that needed to be fixed. That was kind of a secondary piece of the thinking there, but it was all driven by investor demand.
So that motivation raises some really interesting questions. When I teach securities regulation at the law school, I ask my students to think about why we have securities regulation rather than letting individual companies decide for themselves what sorts of commitments they're going to make. And one of the things we think through is the costs and benefits of the standardization that comes from having a single federal regulatory regime. In other aspects of corporate operations, we have a lot of variability. With regards to corporate governance, for example, we have a variety, we have 50 different state regimes. So let's just think about that for a moment. Might there have been some benefit to having a variety of private regimes rather than a single regime mandated by the SEC?
Well, I don't think that the regime that was in existence was without benefit. So absolutely, there was benefit being derived from that regime, and certainly. But how many years has it been now? It's been maybe a decade, depending on how you look at it, of this kind of, you want to call it experimentation or variety and that type of thing. And what happens, of course, is that companies are incented and understandably are going to just produce the information voluntarily that reflects well on the company. And they're going to be less inclined to produce the information that doesn't reflect as well. And at the end of the day, that ends up steering capital, in places where it's not intended. So my view was we do need to centralize it. After TCFD did all of that great work, there's a lot of coordinated, a lot that has gone on to sort of reach some consensus on certain points. I think if we had tried to do, or they, I need to switch my pronouns to they, if they had tried to do this, even 5 years ago, it was arguably premature. But I feel like that voluntary market has matured to the place now that it's time.
Let's turn to the greenhouse gas emission disclosure requirements. Let's just begin by thinking about the philosophy behind it. So I think many people would argue, the critics of the initiative would argue, that it is the job of the SEC to require disclosure of risks that relate to financial performance. And the greenhouse gas disclosure risks, whatever value they may have to society, aren't directly connected to financial performance. What do you think about that?
Well, I'll start with this concept, or this precept, which is they have a financial impact. This we know. There's plenty out there to show that the impact, the damages, and the loss associated with the greenhouse gas emissions from around the world are causing billions of dollars in damage. So it's not divorced from financials. It's just that it's externalized by many companies. And so, I do take the point that you can't necessarily translate scopes 1, 2, and 3 to a dollar, into a dollar, so that you know exactly how much is impacting the company on any given moment. But it is certainly the case that these emissions. So maybe this actually leads to a discussion on double materiality, because really the question is it material to the company, the emissions that they have right now and on any given day? And then there's another question of, are the impacts, how is the company impacting the external world? I think that is more of a continuum and less of a dichotomy than people discuss, because it really does, in my view, get to the question of, are you looking at short-term, medium-term, long-term? and where on that scale does it fall? Eventually, these costs that are being externalized are going to be internalized for the most part, one way or another. So having your eye on that, and investors want this information. And I think it's quite reasonable. As you know, the standard for what's material to an investor, or it's what's material to a reasonable investor, it seems entirely reasonable to me for investors to want to know how companies are impacting the environment as they think about what to do with their money. So I do take the point that it may not be, in every instance, financially material, depending on which of the scopes you're looking at, but it does seem to me that at a minimum in the long term it will be, and so you want to watch those trend lines to see which direction the company is going.
So relatedly, just to sharpen things a bit, do you think it's appropriate for the SEC to require the disclosure of information that isn't necessarily related to financial performance, but which investors might care about anyway? Investors have a variety of motivations, only one of which is the earning of profits. Is it appropriate for the SEC to require disclosure about these other things that investors might care about? And relatedly, I'd ask, is there some sort of limiting principle, given that the array of things that investors might care about could potentially be limitlessly vast? They could care about diversity or other forms of environmental pollution and so on. Is there some limit we can draw on the non-financial sorts of concerns that we can appropriately require at the SEC?
Well, I think with greenhouse gas emissions, I don't think there's any question about the fact that it will have a financial impact on companies over time. So I do think that's potentially qualitatively different from some of these others. Now, your question, which I have been asked a lot, what does it mean to be reasonable? Doesn't it still have to be connected to financial performance? I'm not sure what the answer is on that. And frankly, we may find out in the courts, although I don't think that's how this climate rule will play out. I think that will play out in a different sort of legal construct. But, when the Supreme Court said reasonable investor, they didn't say anything more than that. I do think that it needs to be enough reasonable investors. It can't be like, the demand here, we had $130 trillion of assets under management saying we need climate-related information. That, to me, points up a level of reasonableness just based on the sheer numbers. But I do think that we can't. So let's say, for example, there are groups that want to know if a company engages in religious discrimination or wants to know, I don't suggest that no matter what, if investors want it, it's fine. I do think there are ways to separate the wheat from the chaff, and especially when it comes to climate. I think that it's much clearer that there will be a financial impact. The only question is when, and there's a broad swath of the market that wants the data. So to me, those two kind of answer the question. The answer to where the line is, I don't know where that line is, but wherever it is, I think the climate rule is north of that. So
maybe this is what you were talking about when you said that 5 or 10 years ago it might have been premature.
Well, so yes, both in terms of the of investor sort of interest and demand, but also there, I was referring to how well developed and how much consensus there is around things like risk governance and strategy that TCFD has built up.
So tell us a little bit about what motivated you to focus on the TCFD paradigm.
Well, when you say me, I will say that the agency, because of course it was a massive group effort, but the simplicity, first of all, there's been, that work has been ongoing for several years, and it's multi-jurisdictional, it's got industry, there's so many people in this space that were working very hard on that for a number of years. And a lot of companies are already reporting under the TCFD regime. So a lot of it was, let's leverage all of this work that's already been done, simplify at many levels kind of the data. We know what companies, they already know how to do this. We know investors like this regime. We know industry has sort of, in many instances, approved of the regime. So it was just a way of leveraging all of the work, all the private ordering that's been done up to this point.
And that builds on what you were saying about investor demand. There was a clear kind of settling of the market on this paradigm. That makes sense. So maybe you could just tell us, just briefly, so everyone's on the same page about the three scopes involved in the paradigm.
Sure. So it comes from the GHG protocol. I'm sure most of you, or maybe all of you, are familiar with that. Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Scope 1 are the emissions that you create when, in the process of whatever it is that you do. Scope 2 is the energy that you purchase. And then Scope 3, that's the complicated one, and that is the emissions that are in your upstream and down, in your value chain, upstream and downstream. So that's just again, a very succinct, it's a complicated protocol, especially when it comes to Scope 3. There are some 14 categories in Scope 3 that companies have to kind of sift through. And so I don't mean to suggest by talking about it this succinctly that it's simple. It's not simple, although arguably scopes 1 and 2 are not that difficult, especially scope 2. You know what your power bill is. But that's just sort of the nutshell of the GHG protocol.
All right, let's talk then about scope 3, since that is the complicated one. If my understanding is correct, that's where a lot of the challenges have arisen so far in people's commentary on the proposal. So a lot of the concern has focused on how investors will get the information required to comply with Scope 3. There's questions in particular about how they'll get it from private companies. If I've got a private company in my value chain that isn't reporting Scopes 1 and 2, how do I know what this private company is producing in terms of carbon? Tell me how you think about how issuers will address that problem.
So this is one thing, of course, we've gotten a lot of comments on since the rule proposal went out, and I've had dozens, maybe even hundreds of conversations with folks on this point. And, so let me start with this. First of all, private companies, many of them are already under pressure from their investors, from PE funds, from any number of other, to sort of isolate and identify their emissions. So that's already happening at some level. And then secondly, the rule proposal in its current form allows companies to estimate them. And that is what they're doing right now. The companies that are reporting on their Scope 3 emissions, for the most part, are having to estimate them. And the SEC's proposal would allow for that. So between the notion that private companies are already doing this, we've got efforts out there. ILPA has been kind of trying to get some consensus around this. There are others but between those two things. So you clearly just have to make a good faith attempt to under the proposal anyway, to estimate the Scope 3 emissions in your value chains. And that is something, like I said, companies have already been doing for quite some time. The other thing I'll say is there is a phase-in for the Scope 3 emissions. I don't know how it's going to get adopted. If it gets adopted the way it's proposed, it will phase in over 3 years. So companies will have time to get that work done. It's not going to be required to be audited. And they need to make it and there's a safe harbor around it as well. So there are lots of protections built into the proposal to ease that burden.
When you say safe harbor, you mean a safe harbor from liability for false disclosures?
That's right.
Okay. Let's now shift gears and talk about the climate risk disclosures. And I'll ask maybe a slightly different version of a question I'd asked earlier, because the climate risk disclosures are different. But before we do that, I'm sorry, tell me what is involved in the climate risk disclosures. Just kind of summarize that for us.
Well, so that is, we drilled down a fair amount there, instead of just saying something like, tell us what your risks are, because we all know what that generally produces. If you've ever read the risk factors in somebody's prospectus, they're generally very boilerplate. and we wanted more than that. So the notion of, so what we tried to do, instead of just saying, because again, assuming that it's material, you would have expected to see these risk disclosures already, and many companies do have sort of risk factor disclosures that simply say, like if you look back at PG&E's disclosures over time before the wildfires, they had plenty of risk disclosures in there that said there's a risk that, we might burn down the state of California. And I mean, almost that sort of blunt. But I don't think that was very useful for investors in understanding the actual risks that were associated with what they were and were not doing with respect to the maintenance. So I think what we tried to do is ask ourselves, what exactly do investors need to know about specific risks that each individual company face, and put a little bit more meat on the bones, kind of the way we do in the MD&A, where we have a little bit more of a charted, we don't just leave it as an open narrative, but we'll see what that produces. We also allow for opportunities to be disclosed. We don't require it, but we permit it, and I think that is an important tool as well.
So part of what I find interesting about the contrast between the climate risk disclosures on the one hand and the greenhouse gas emission disclosures on the other is that with the climate risk disclosures, there is a really direct and obvious link to financial performance. You're disclosing risks to the company's future performance. Mm-hmm. We could still ask a version of the question that we talked about earlier, which is, why single out this kind of risk rather than some other kind of risk? Mm-hmm. Companies face lots of different kinds of risks that vary from industry to industry, and some of those risks are even really salient to investors who are concerned about ESG. There could be risks from Russian militarism, for example, or the rising cost of healthcare, or state and local government pension debt. So why, given the vast array of risks to a company's financial performance, why single out this one?
Yeah. I think there are a couple of things that make climate risk arguably unique. And one of them is essentially, obviously, risk by definition is something that hasn't occurred yet. Right? It's like it might happen, and I need to gauge the risk associated with this if it does. Climate is happening, and it's going to happen. So it's a dead certainty. Russian militarization is certainly a risk. We don't know what will happen from that. We don't know, but what we do know what's going to happen from climate risk. We have a fair amount of information on that. So I view that as qualitatively different. In that regard, it's also different in the sense of how complex it is, although that's not to suggest other risks aren't complex, but climate risk is uniquely complex in the sense that you have to take into geopolitical risk. You have to, if you read some of the data that has been put out by the Bank for International Settlements, they've done a lot of great work on this. They call it the green swan events. Pandemic is similar, another sort of green swan event, but different in the sense of, sure, there will be another pandemic potentially at some point, but we don't know. However, with climate, we know. We know we're on this path. We have a pretty good idea. It's not to say we have absolute precision in the science, but we have a pretty good idea of where it's going. So we know that these costs that these companies are externalizing are in fact going to end up being, they've put out targets. If you have a target, how can you not have costs associated with achieving that goal or that commitment? So I do think climate is somewhat unique from those other risks, and those other risks too are harder, I think, in some ways to quantify. We have a lot of information on how to quantify the risks that companies face around transition, the risks that they face around physical. It isn't perfect, and it's complicated, but a lot more information out there that would allow a company to give investors a much better sort of view than just to say, hey, climate risk is out there, and we have some factories that are near, sort of near the ocean, and we might have, so that's not going to be very helpful to, which is not to say that you don't need that, But even that, you don't get the kind of drill down where you can see where the factories are, where you actually know where the risk is. So I feel like climate is unique.
As I understand the climate risk disclosure proposal, issuers are required to disaggregate the impact of climate-related events and risks if it's more than 1% of a given line item. So what's the logic of the 1% requirement, and where did that number come from?
Well, are you asking the logic of the disaggregation more broadly, or just how did we hit on 1%?
I guess more about 1%, but both are interesting.
Yeah, so because I actually think of the 5 pieces of the rule that this is it's in a tie for first place, in my view, as the most important. And the reason is because that is the piece that will measure the current impacts right now on financial statements. This is how investors will know how climate is impacting the firm right now. It will also reveal trend lines. So you'll see over time, is it going up? Is it going down? Is it going in the direction that we want to see it going? And I think, it would be great if FASB was sort of out in front of us on this and had done some work to actually make sure that many of the estimates and assumptions that go into a lot of the accounting principles actually accurately would account for climate risk, but they haven't really done that work yet. Mm-hmm. So this is a way of trying to get investors the information they need. I actually think it will also help companies understand better how climate is impacting. I think it's going to be hard to do. I think, and that one piece I got much more discussion about than I expected. I talked to CFOs all over the country. My brother is a CFO of a huge public company, and he was definitely giving me an earful about that. So I don't think it's going to be easy for them to disaggregate those impacts. I think it's going to be difficult, and I think they're going to need a lot of guidance and a lot of time to work through and figure out how to do that. But I think it's critically important. Now, the 1% piece, that too, you may, I'm sure you know that in accounting, the rule of thumb says that 5%, quantitatively 5% is where materiality lies. But in the law, you see it in many cases combined with other factors, it can be less than that. So, did we get that exactly right? I don't know. And my view is, I'd be perfectly willing, if it were me, making the decision today, to move that to a place that people feel more comfortable with, somewhere south of 5%, obviously, but, somewhere in there. Or, could we just say materiality? I don't know. But it's not that I'm wed to the 1%, but I do think the disaggregation piece is really critical.
I think it's inevitable that whatever number you choose is going to feel a little bit arbitrary.
Yeah.
But I'm sure the practicing bar would appreciate having a clear number, or not. I don't know. That's an interesting question.
There is certainly a lot of, you can save a lot of money from that, from not having to constantly go to your law firm and say, here's our number, what do you think, yes or no? And so.
Right. Let's step back. The benefits to requiring this disclosure, we've talked about a fair bit, how a lot of investors might value having this information. Let's think about the costs. This is not going to be cheap to produce, as you've acknowledged. Do you worry that as a result of these costs, some issuers from outside the United States will choose not to come to the United States and seek capital here? Or similarly, that private issuers in the United States will choose not to go public? We saw something kind of similar after the passage of Sarbanes-Oxley, or at least many people believe we saw something. We saw people staying away from the public markets as a result of Sarbanes-Oxley. Are you concerned that we'll see something similar here?
Well, footnote to what we saw with Sarbanes is that we now know well how much Sarbanes did improve the financial statements of public companies. So, and that's what I would expect here. But absolutely, that's something that SEC thinks about with every rule that adds anything to the disclosure regime. We think about the whole picture and ask ourselves, is this still the right approach? Is this manageable? So, but to answer your question of, am I concerned that companies will either not come to the U.S. or potentially not go public, I think some of that will occur. And I think certainly it's also true that some companies will shear off their dirty assets, their fossil fuel assets into the private sector. So I do think we will see some of that, but I think there's enough investor concern out there and enough investor demand, both in the private markets and in the public markets, to sort of prevent that from getting. I'd be surprised if we saw a significant measurable impact that you could trace directly to the climate rule. But we will see. That's the reason, though, that we did, in the proposal, like I said, we put in safe harbors, we staged it in over time, we shared out on scope 3, we said the smaller reporting companies don't have to do it. So we did a lot of things to try to address and tailor the rule with that in mind. Is it enough? We'll see.
Let's think about how companies will satisfy the disclosure obligations going forward. You've already talked about the growth of a vast private and voluntary operation to encourage carbon disclosure. How do you see the private sector facilitating compliance with this proposed rule and with the disclosure of carbon emissions more generally?
So I do see them moving in this direction, and I've had a lot. That's actually been since I stepped down. That's been one of the areas that I've been very focused on, and had lots of conversations with lots of folks on this point to understand where the private sector is, not the private sector, but the private markets are on this point. And so they're at a more nascent stage, obviously, than I think public companies are. And it's all voluntary, just like it was and continues to be, I guess you would say, for public companies right now. But you have efforts underway at ILPA. You have some of the larger private equity firms trying to put together and shepherd through to get some sort of consensus around what's an appropriate, and then to aggregate the data. Again, this would not be public data. This would just be provided to the investors in these private companies, but I think they are on a trajectory. They're at an early stage, and they need help trying to figure out how to get to a better industry consensus, if you will. Now, the SEC's rule, should it become final and effective, will also impact private firms because of the reason that they are so many of them in the value chains of public companies. So public companies are going to be more incented, I would assume, to reduce their scope 3 emissions, which will mean they will be more focused on what what private firms in their value chains are doing. And I think that too will prompt some of them to really get in there and analyze what they're doing. For example, many of you may know Walmart has a program, they have a name for it, and I can't remember what it is right now, but they are undertaking education with their suppliers and vendors on how to help them reduce their scope 3 emissions. It's voluntary, but they're out there like trying right now to teach and to encourage the folks in their scope 3 emissions to reduce emissions. I think you'll see more of that.
That's fascinating. So there will be pressure even on private companies.
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. What do you think? It seems likely.
It's got to happen.
To me.
It's got to happen.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the commitments that many companies have made towards decarbonization. So this rule, the essence of this rule as proposed as I understand it, is not so much to require companies to hit any particular carbon threshold, but to require disclosures with regards to what they're doing. Yep. They're required both to describe the amount of emissions they're currently putting into the atmosphere. They're also required to disclose any commitments or goals they've set towards reducing their releases of carbon. But as I understand it, we talked before a little bit about how you feel like the path to getting to achievement of some of these commitments is going to be difficult and uncertain. Tell us what some of the obstacles are.
Well, I will say that we have seen a real plethora of these goals of net zero commitments, and I have had lots of conversations, and it does seem to me that many of these firms do not know how they are going to actually do the work of decarbonizing at this point. So that's why I think it's important in the rule proposal, if you have said, I have a goal, to also disclose your progress toward that goal and your approach to achieving it. I think what I would love to see, and I think there are some that are kind of doing a little of this work and it's in early stages, is some open source modeling for decarbonization that is potentially on an industry by industry or sector by sector basis, so that, because a lot of firms have done a lot of great work in this space, but those are the ones with more resources. And so it would be great if some of the ones with fewer resources could benefit from some of that work to understand where are the hot spots, what are the easiest places, what should I target first, what's going to cost me the most, where can I think a lot of companies are intending to rely on carbon offsets in a way that I don't think is going to be feasible. I don't think that market is where it needs to be. I'm not alone in that view. I think it's got people are trying to scale it, but I think it needs to actually first be shrunk down and then scaled, because right now I don't think it's workable. So I think a lot of firms are expecting to use carbon offsets, and I wonder how well that's going to work. So I am concerned about that, but it's not an SEC concern. That's not that's really not their bailiwick. But it's an investor concern, because if investors care about where you are on that path, you have to have a plan. You've said to them you're going to do this, and you need a plan that's feasible. And those, some of those commitments are as early as 2030, 2035. I mean, they're, in business terms, right around the corner. So. Yeah,
right. So then, it's interesting that you're hypothesizing that there will be companies that are committed to doing this, that have made significant progress, and then share with the world what the methods they've taken to achieve it. Do you worry that competitive considerations will discourage them from sharing their business plans?
I do. So I didn't mean to suggest that I think they're all going to just do all this great work and then say, here, world, here's what you should do. What I think would make more sense is, because exactly for the reason that you suggest, but what I think would make more sense is for trade groups to organize around and create open source models. They could, borrow from and try to learn from what they can about what they're doing at Ford or what they're doing, But I don't think it's likely that some of these firms are going to just open up and say, here's how we do it. But does that mean it can't be constructed from the outside? It can. And so I just was saying, like we did with TCFD, I would like to see some sort of modeling of how to go about doing this. And it has to be on an industry by industry basis, because it's going to be unique to the industries.
Of course, right, yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I think we now have a few minutes for questions from the audience. We've got a lot of hands going up. That's great. Yeah.
Hey, Allison. Ilmi. Good to see
Ilmi,
you.
I thought that was you.
That was me. I want to steel man this idea about disclosing transition plans and hear your views on the best alternative argument that I can come up with about why not to have to require any disclosure about them. And that would be that they are by nature puffery. In other words, that they don't tell you anything about that they are commitments, but they're not commitments because they don't tell you anything about what the business plans to do. Is there a version of that argument that is a steel man? I've been puzzling over, is there a version where we could credibly treat a net zero target or commitment as legitimately puffery, that a reasonable investor would think that has nothing to do with the capital plans of the company or anything about its business? Can we explore that steel man version?
Well, I will say that I've done a lot of research and read a lot of cases on puffery and what it is. Because of having been a securities lawyer for 25 years, companies are not saying, we are going to do better than anyone else in the world on getting to net zero before, that's puffery. We are the best at getting to net zero, and we are but we will be here's where we are right now, and we will be here on this date. To me, that's not, I would be surprised if a court were to conclude that was puffery. Is it material? That's a different question, right? So in other words, I'm not suggesting that it's an automatic anti-fraud violation but because it needs to be material, and you also, it's a forward-looking statement by definition. So, you need to have a good faith basis for making that statement, but you don't have to be right, because that's the nature of forward-looking statements under the securities laws. But I would be very surprised to see somebody prevail. I suppose that if it's stated in a particular way that leans more towards we're doing the best and we're better than this than our competitors, maybe, but that isn't how they read. If you go in and look at them, that's not what they say.
Do you hear me? Yeah. Hi, I'm from Columbia University. My question is, US has largely been a bit of a slow mover in terms of ESG disclosures and climate disclosure, especially in comparison to Europe. So when you were designing these rules, what was the thinking in the room? Was there a large sort of need to align with the European standards, or were you more interested in giving time to the American companies to get up to speed with how where Europe is currently in terms of the climate disclosure position? So I just want to know how you balance the whole process of alignment versus making sure that the rules gave sufficient time and space to American companies to align with the new rules here. How did you balance this process?
Yeah, that was actually one of the toughest challenges, I think, that we face, because my own view on that has long been that alignment with international approaches is extremely important. For obvious reasons. This is a global economy. It's a global problem. There are multinational companies that are going to be subject to, a patchwork quilt of potential disclosure regimes. And so I personally was very focused on doing everything I could to align. Now, as you know, we ended up putting out a proposal right at the same time as there was a consultation open at the ISSB, and so it wasn't ideal. But the option there was to just wait and see what happens, and then try to react to that. And that did not seem ideal to me either. And one of the first things I did when I stepped in as acting chair, I was only in that role for like almost 4 months, but begin those conversations, bilateral and multilateral, at the FSB, at IOSCO. I'm here, we want to talk. I got a lot of a mix of welcome and skepticism, which I understood. It was sort of like, oh, it's just like World War II. You show up late and you're, and so, but I understood. I understood the point, and I tried hard to sort of convey a genuine commitment to work together and try to align. We'll see where that lands, but I didn't think that delay was the right approach. I feel like we may have a window here to get this done, and I didn't want to risk losing that window.
Hi,
go ahead.
I'm Anna. I'm a third year at the law school, so apologies in advance for the lawyerly question. Something I've been thinking about and many have been thinking about is this sort of specter looming over agencies trying to use their existent authority to mitigate the effects of climate change, and in particular, the court's decision in West Virginia v. EPA this year and the percolating lower court decisions that are taking up Justice Gorsuch's call related to the non-delegation doctrine. I wonder, not asking you to make predictions here, but in terms of sort of the arguments that the agency is inevitably going to have to rely on in defending this rule, how well a job you think of really sticking to this line about investor demand and investor protection is going to fare in the courts.
Well, if you're asking about the major questions doctrine, there are a lot of potential challenges that this rule will face. There'll be litigation, just period, full stop. And then the question is like, where are the most potential weak spots? There's some First Amendment challenges with the rule, but certainly the major questions doctrine. The thing about that, and I'm not a constitutional scholar, so I suspect that Professor Morley would know better than I how to analyze the risk.
Sure,
there.
I know less.
It's a relatively new doctrine, and it seems to have just been kind of invented out of whole cloth. So how you predict where that will go is not an easy exercise. My own view on that is, for that reason, I don't see the value in sort of clipping our own wings in advance and then spending years anyway defending a rule that isn't going to potentially get investors where they need to be. So, but is there a reasonable chance that there's 5 or even 6 votes at the U.S. Supreme Court under major questions? Yes, I think there is. We tried to write the proposal in a way that the economic analysis is severable, so that they, if need be, they can sever. They can still choose not to do that. And I hope in the final they'll do something similar, so that you can sever not just the piece of the rule that you may decide is outside of the SEC's jurisdiction, but the economic analysis as well. That would leave viability on what's left. If you don't have an economic analysis that fits with what's left, you have a problem. So we're aware of that, or they are aware of that. I hope and expect in the final rule you'll see some approaches that are designed to try to mitigate that. But how you can predict it, I don't know.
I think we've got a question up here. Yeah.
Yes. Hi, Allison. Tracy Lewis from Public Citizen in Washington, D.C. So glad to have you here and get to hear you in person. I have a particular question around the organized disinformation attacks on the rule and its promulgation. And a new little twist now is that Big Ag is reaching out to small farmers, and in particular, small farmers of color, telling them that the burdens of Scope 3 disclosures will be crippling, and they are now, of course, reaching out to their senators. I don't know if you just saw that Tester letter. It came out today, yeah. Right? So I was curious if you could share some thoughts that you may have on ways to counteract this disinformation for advocates and policymakers who are in full support of the rule and all of it in Scope 3 and retaining Scope 3 in particular.
Yeah. I have watched that wave kind of progress, and what I will say is, as I said before, you can estimate. And this is something, so I've had discussions myself with folks at agriculture to basically reassure them, and my own views, it's not on behalf of the SEC, but to say, let me explain to you why I don't think that's a real issue. And there's some scholarship out there too. You may have seen the Center for American Progress has put out some information on that to try to correct the record where that's concerned. But it's a problem, and I have been watching it sort of grow. I hope that we can kind of get across, but it's a pretty simple response at some level where you just say, we can estimate. You are not required to calculate your own emissions. However, what you and I both know is that there's also a lot of money to be made for farmers if they do decide to switch to a more sustainable, so that's another kind of flip side of that coin that isn't really being out there and isn't being discussed. But I have, it's not the first time we've seen these kinds of campaigns, and I hope that we can counter it effectively. I hope we'll see more research out there, but again, I don't know how much. I think the response is pretty simple and straightforward, which is you don't have to do it. They're telling you this, and it's just not true. It's like, show me, sit down and show me where it says you have to do that, and we'll see.
If I can interject here, let me just ask a quick question, which is the flip side of that, which is, if companies are not going to face liability or private liability for making inaccurate disclosures, and if they're allowed to estimate, what is the incentive to put a lot of effort into this? Can companies just make these disclosures and not worry that they're wildly inaccurate?
Well, so you're referring to the safe harbor.
Yeah.
And, I think the answer is, of course, we're going to see some of that. But we have to make a call and land somewhere on the spectrum. Now, my own view on the safe harbor, if I had been, writing it myself and on a clean slate, I would have put conditions into the safe harbor that weren't just good faith. That's the same one as you see like in the PSLRA and the like. I would have preferred to see us say, if you stick to the greenhouse gas protocol, and if you do, if you meet certain conditions, then the safe harbor is available to protect against something like that. But on balance, I still supported the way it went out because I do understand you're weighing a lot of things. And I do think companies are rightly concerned and anxious about how to get there. So would it make sense down the road after companies have had 5 years of experience working with this to refine that safe harbor and or put in some additional controls around what they're doing on scope 3? I think it would. But for now, to me, I felt like it was the right approach to try to, and even as you know, even as we think I think we're doing something that's more accommodative, we're still getting an awful lot back from companies on that. So,
we've got another question here. Yeah.
Thanks for coming. My name is Bruce Kahn from Shelton Capital Management and Columbia University. I wonder if you could just spend just a short few minutes on the ESG labeling rule that's being proposed, because it seems to me like, it's holding ESG to a different standard that we hold the rest of finance to. So if you can look in all the ADVs of every fund out there, not one will stipulate that whether they use GAAP or non-GAAP earnings estimates for their valuation. Why are you then asking firms to say, well, this is how I'm going to do ESG, and that has to be codified, for 10 pages? That seems like a double standard. And so for that rule and the climate rule, do you think, what is your sense of how the shift in political winds could carry these rules a little bit to the sidelines and not be as important as we all hope it becomes?
well, so the first part of your question on ESG funds, I'll take that first, and then we can shift to the political winds. But so on ESG, one thing we know, we've seen this space grow like no other in a very short time. So I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but I've seen them, and I know you have too. Of the trillions of dollars now, people, depending on how you define it, right, that are flowing into this space. And that's kind of the problem right there, is like, what do you mean when we say an ESG investment? So I think there's an awful lot of potential for greenwashing out there. I do think ESG warrants a special treatment because it is so ubiquitous, and everyone is slapping that label on many times, and it makes it hard for the firms that are actually doing the work, who are sort of have a sensible regime in place to compete with other firms who are simply freer, I would say, to sort of make statements about ESG that may or may not be as accurate as investors would like to see. So I guess I do think it warrants a separate treatment. It sounds like what you're saying is you think that that because they don't have to drill down on things like financials, why should they have to drill down on ESG? But they don't tout their financials to investors. Well, they tout returns. They tout returns. They don't say, we follow GAAP like nobody else, and if you want a GAAP fund, you come to us, right? But they do say ESG is the way to go. You want ESG, come. So I think it's unique, and it warrants a different. Reasonable people may differ on that. I will also say this: I was very surprised at the comments that we've gotten on that, and there does seem to be a fair amount of angst and a lot of. I'm not sure we got it right on that proposal. But that's not to say I don't think one is warranted, but I do think potentially some significant changes need to occur between proposal and final. Unlike the climate rule, which I think my own view is I like the structure of it now. I think the ESG rule needs some work. On the political winds question, that's that could take, we could talk about that for quite a while. I don't know. Will it have an impact? It may well. And anything that gets pushed into the realm of the CRA timeline, where the new Congress could pull it back. I think the SEC will have its eyes on that and be thinking about that as it looks to finalize some of these rules. But I can't say that I can predict accurately because I don't know what the political landscape is going to look like in 2 years. But,
Yes.
Hey, my name's Nadeem Damian, a current master's student at the School of the Environment here at Yale. Perhaps a bit of an off-base question, but I think nonetheless important to ask. You mentioned reliance on the TCFD in sort of coming up with this work. We've seen a lot of, interest and motivation and around the TNFD on nature-related financial disclosures and greater focus from the private sector on considering what is nature positive. I'm wondering, in your work, where is that conversation fitting in terms of structuring more formalized regulation around nature-related risk? Yeah. I think it's taken quite some time for us to get to this point around climate, but it seems like the pace at which regulation is being formed is accelerating. So I'm wondering, what does that runway look like, and how does it fit into this larger conversation around climate?
Yeah, at the time of proposal, we certainly looked at and thought about and considered, and we had comments in the file because I had put out a request for comment even before we did the proposal. We had comments in the file about a number of different, biodiversity, water use, and so we did consider if and whether we ought to include some of that in a proposal, and ultimately, that the decision was made not to do that, in part because I don't think it's matured in the way that climate change approaches have, and in part because it's hard to know once you step into that arena where to stop. What's the right? Should it be biodiversity? Should it be water usage? Should it be, pollution? There are a number of different things. So I think my own view, and this is, just my opinion, that we're a ways away from seeing the securities laws take that up. I think there needs to be more private ordering going on before you get to a place where, if ever, where it makes sense for the securities laws to consider that. But I don't rule it out. I just think, I don't think we're near that at this point. I'd be very surprised to see the SEC take it up in the near future.
So we have time, I think, for one more question. Yes, right.
Hi, my name is Scott Kalb, and first I just wanted to say thank you to Commissioner Lee. I know that speaking on my behalf of my constituents, my colleagues, we all consider you to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest, commissioner in the history of the SEC. So thank you for your work.
Thanks.
The project you were talking about is called Project Gigaton, the Walmart
Yes,
project?
yeah,
Yes,
that's
and
right.
they were using the idea is to use their network of suppliers,
Yep.
they have thousands and thousands, to reduce carbon emissions. The goal is 1 billion tons by 2030.
Yeah.
They're 40% of the way there.
Yeah.
So,
Gigaton. I was trying to remember the name.
Gigaton, Project
yeah.
Gigaton. My question to you, actually, it's a little bit off, but even as you're talking about, putting forward these rules, and by the way, that 500-page rule with 322 questions that we're supposed to respond to, that was rough. Right, go do your homework. Okay, sorry. Look, even as we are pushing forward on disclosures, a lot of companies want disclosures on climate change because they don't know what to do.
Yep.
They're being pushed by their investors. And, the way the rules are now is if it's important, you should disclose it. That's fine, but we've reached the useful life, the end of life of that kind of a disclosure regime, as you were saying. But even as we're moving towards greater disclosures, we have many, many companies that are actually pushing to try and stop that disclosure regime. And there's an element of greenwashing because they're out and saying, yes, we're working towards climate change, and then they're spending money on the other side to try and stop climate disclosures and environmental protections of different kinds. And one of the problems that I see for the SEC is that they're not allowed to require disclosures on corporate spending. And maybe you can talk about that, the rule that's in place, and whether or not that's going to change. Because I think...
You mean political spending?
Corporate political spending. In other words,
Yes.
we don't know, investors don't know, one element of greenwashing is, you know, a company, I don't know, I don't want to name any particular name, but a company can go out and say, yes, we're doing all this stuff on climate change, and then there's, you know, meanwhile spending $50 million towards supporting groups to try and fight it. So, and we don't know. We don't have that information. It's not required. So do you think the SEC should be regulating corporate political spending disclosures? And what's the story with this rule?
So the short answer is yes, I do think that there should be some disclosure of political spending. And as you alluded, there is a rider on the budget of the SEC, and has been for several years now, that precludes us from doing that. So we can't. And arguably, we can't even, depending on how you, that's right. Arguably, they can't even enforce, like, let's say somebody lied about that. That rider could be interpreted in a way that would suggest that the SEC couldn't even go in and enforce, if it were a material lie, an anti-fraud case against them based on that rider. So I find it ill-advised, and I would love to see it removed. I would love to see the SEC take it up and consider what it should look like. You know, I don't know, but I will tell you, you know, the Center for Political Accountability, Bruce Freed and Carl, if you know those folks, have done a lot of great work here, and they put out a report very recently, a forensic analysis. I'm trying to think of the name of it, but where they traced funds through. And they said, here's how we can tell you, and it wasn't easy. It was a tortured research project that took them quite a long time, but they were able to show a number of corporations and the money flowing into the pockets of, for example, election deniers, a robocall that went out on January 5th, you know, and then lots of the kind of spending that you had a reference to, which is like trade groups where, individual members of the trade group are not going to speak up and say something, but they're giving the money to the trade group, and the trade group is adamantly, lobbying against, say, climate disclosures, while the members are saying we're all for. So that's a problem. Trade group spending is different, of course, but not when it goes to like PACs and that type of thing. So my own view is investors, companies are choosing to make statements in that space, but that investors cannot test. And not only that, but just the importance of what's happening with political contributions and whether managers are incented to make the kinds of contributions that their investors think are worthwhile. I think that's a big open question. I think they're more incented to make the kinds of contributions that fit them personally, or that they individually think may or may not be best for the business. I think I think there should be more sunlight around that, and I'd love to see companies stepping up and being more transparent. There's an index that shows kind of how well companies do on that scale, and it has a long way to go. I think so. That's my own personal view. Do I think the SEC will do it? They can't right now. Will the rider get lifted? It didn't in the last session. I was very disappointed to see that. And if there was ever a time that it would have been in the last budget. So that's, who knows?
This has been a fascinating conversation. Thanks to you for coming. And also thanks to the organizers of this conference. It's been a great day. I think we've all learned a lot.
Thank you very much, dear Allison and John, for this superb, in-depth and frank conversation about the landmark proposals made by the SEC. I should say a little bit of corporate disclosure here. We're very proud here at the Yale Initiative on Sustainable Finance that our research had been referenced by the SEC when it made its rule on climate-related disclosure. End of a parenthesis. It is my responsibility and privilege as research director of the Yale Initiative on Sustainable Finance to conclude this 2022 Annual Symposium. And it could not come at a better time. Between the parallel pressures of market demand and rising regulatory scrutiny that are weighing to shape sustainable finance in a myriad of ways, and despite a clear direction that we know and share, these pressures have not applied linearly. I think that is a good takeaway from today. The thought leadership and cutting-edge research on display today have enlightened the complexity, the challenges, but also the solutions that we can and need to seize to support the transition to a net zero and sustainable economy. The Yale Initiative on Sustainable Finance is a joint venture of the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy and the Yale Center for Business and Environment. And so it's on the behalf of Todd Cort here, Dynasty, who's in Geneva, and Rob Klee, that I wanted, and myself, that I wanted to thank all of you, the speaker and attendants who come from other states, most of them, or other continents, for your engagement during this day. It is, all of this has been the result of a team effort, and so our thanks go to our sponsors, our platinum sponsor, BNY Mellon, our gold sponsor, Avangrid, but most importantly, our heartfelt thanks go to those who are behind the scenes, to the teams of the Yale School of Environment, and particularly Lily Steinhauser, who is here, who's been instrumental in making this day a success. In the team also in members of the School of Management and the Center for Business Environment I was mentioning is notably Amy Barner, without whom we couldn't be in this room today, and also the Yale Conference and Events and the catering team who provided such good food and who were all involved in the organization of this symposium, our 5th symposium since the creation of YISF and the first in person since COVID. Next year, in August 2023, we'll have a privilege not to host this classic annual symposium that brings together practitioners and academics, as is our trademark, but the International GRASFI, the Global Research Alliance on Sustainable Finance Investing Conference here at Yale. So I look forward to see you on this occasion, and I want to thank you very much all for being here, and have a safe trip back home. Thank you.